A familiar face is taking on a new job for the Liberal Party. The former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is taking on a special advisor role to the leader of the Liberal Party, who also happens to be the Prime Minister. And Carney has a big job ahead of him. Canada's economy is sliding dramatically compared to the United States. In 2023, the U.S. reported a GDP per capita of almost $65,000. That is compared to Canada, which is just over $45,500. So, how did Canada stray so far from the United States? That's what University of Calgary economics professor Trevor Tombe has been looking into, and he joins me now. Professor Tombe, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So this divergence is of great concern to a lot of economically minded people. You have been tracking this divergence between the Canadian and the U.S. economy. What's the underlying cause?
Well, there's no single underlying cause here. Otherwise, it would be an easy challenge to fix. I mean, Canada's economy, like any, is large and complex. And recent years, there have been a lot of really significant challenges for the Canadian economy. We had big drop in commodity prices in 2015 and 16, for example. We've had considerable policy uncertainty over the past decade. And I don't just mean domestic policy uncertainty, but our trading relationship had some rocky years there not too long ago with the United States, and may very well see, I guess we will see soon, whether it has some rocky years to come. And as a very trade-exposed economy, that was no small thing for us to deal with. But that gap between us and the United States is not just large today, it's been widening at a pace that we haven't seen in generations. And so I think it's right that many are kind of raising alarm bells.
And look, I am fully aware that you just said Canada is a very large economy with many different factors, but broadly, does this stem from the U.S. doing something really well or Canada doing something really poorly?
Well, that's a great question. So if we look at last year, you gave the 2023 data. For Canada, that's just slightly below where the Canadian economy was per person 10 years prior to that, back in 2014. Whereas in the United States, we've seen growth of over 19% by that measure. But it's not just us versus the United States that's diverging. Right. Our position relative to the G7 has also been deteriorating. Our divergence with all advanced industrial economies in what's called the OECD group of countries. 2024 might be the first year where Canada falls below the OECD average. And that is a sharp reversal from the roughly 10% advantage that we held for the quarter century between 1990 and 2015. So it's not just a unique American success story. It is really a story about Canada's economy lagging behind where we'd like it to be.
Okay, let's just set aside the U.S. then for a second, because you talk about the other G7 nations. I'm assuming that's maybe with the U.S. data kind of unspooled and looking at the other peers of Germany, France, the U.K., Japan, and Italy. I don't know. But the OECD average is also a compelling one to look at. I mean, what is it fundamentally about Canada's economy that's missing or lagging or weak that it is sliding against the top 32 economies?
Well, again, it's no single area of Canada's economy. Even just last week, Statistics Canada released its latest labor productivity data and found it again showed a decline. So not just low growth, but actually a reduction in labor productivity. And it found a reduction in labor productivity in most Canadian sectors. So again, it is not one silver bullet that we need to point to here. It is really all across the board. But some of the biggest issues here, if we look historically, where does labor productivity growth come from in Canada? Well, since 2000, about 90% of all labor productivity growth that we have had comes from business investment. And that's an area where it's lagging, unfortunately, in Canada. And so thinking about ways of improving the incentives to invest, thinking about tax reforms, for example. And what we're seeing in Canada is actually an increase now over the next couple of years in the effective tax rate that we levy on investment. So really moving in the opposite direction of where we should. So there's no one thing to point to here. There's lots of compounding factors.
So Mark Carney has many things to deal with as he's been brought on to advise the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister on a productivity and economic recovery plan. But when I looked at the analysis you did, it was published on the webpage of the Hub, you reported that if Canada kept pace with the U.S. over the past 2 years, the economy will be 8.5% larger, about $6,200 more in income per Canadian each year. Could we have kept pace with the U.S. over the last 2 years? Because I look at $1 trillion debt at the federal level, a $40 billion deficit, and the political difficulties around that, and you look at the U.S., you talk about printing money and running deficit. They seem to have no limit to their debt, despite the showdowns they have every once in a while about the debt ceiling, and a willingness to just spend and do things like the IRA, uncapped incentives. Could Canada even keep pace with the U.S. if it tried without breaking the bank?
Well, I think the right question there is maybe not could Canada, because there the answer might be maybe, but should Canada have kept pace with the United States? And there the answer is quite clearly no. They have a
Right.
really significant fiscal challenge in the United States that they're going to need to wrestle with, and they're going to have another one of these debt ceiling fights at the end of this month. So the US really does have irresponsible fiscal policy, and that should not be a lesson for Canada. But had we kept pace just with the OECD average, the average of all the advanced industrial economies over the past decade, the economy would be about 7% larger than it is today, kind of similar magnitude as what you quoted over the past two with the United States. So the challenge does get less dramatic when you look between Canada and advanced economies around the world, but the significant challenge is still there.
It's interesting because you talk about how business investment in productivity is one of the areas that is lagging, and I know there were changes of the capital gains tax, which is the inclusion rate of the capital gains, which was not popular with corporate Canada and with small businesses. But then we also have this fight over temporary foreign workers and low-wage workers, which the business community wants to bring in because it keeps their costs down, and they're not willing to pay for domestic Canadian workers to do these things. So is it all policy problems? Is there a reticence to spend in the Canadian business community on top of what may be tax incentive competitive challenges in this country?
Well, a couple answers there. So clearly business incentives matter. It's not just that businesses aren't willing to invest in the Canadian economy. We really must ask what are the reasons why they wouldn't want to. Some of those reasons might be because of taxes, as we have talked about, but in many sectors in the Canadian economy, we have a significant presence of a less than perfect competition, let's say, where there's a great deal of protection for large incumbent firms, barriers to entry. And so when you have just an oligopoly within many critical sectors in the Canadian economy, there might be a lack of competition that provides little incentive to invest in a way that firms under threat would. So there's both reasons why businesses behave in the way they do, both in terms of taxes, but also the broader structure of the Canadian economy. And thinking about liberalizing that, I think, is something that governments should think much more about. And I don't just mean international trade. Interprovincial trade is also one of these areas where there's a great deal of barriers to operating across provincial borders, either as a firm that has operations in many jurisdictions, but also trading goods and services across provincial borders is really difficult. And that's a big drag on productivity. Yeah,
and just shipping, right? Truck driver regulations being different as you cross different borders as you travel across the country, something the premiers always complain about, but then kind of never really get together and get it done. So just as a final last question, if the Prime Minister asked you to join Mark Carney in advising him on economic growth and productivity, what would be the one big thing you'd suggest to him or whoever the next government is that they could attack right away on day one to start changing this gap?
Well, I would certainly not be someone who would give politically useful advice to a new government. I'd say the most important way to boost productivity in the short term would be to think about opening up competition in many critical sectors in the Canadian economy, but also recognizing that Canada is incredibly decentralized. The federal government's limited in what it can do in many important areas like interprovincial trade. So holding some summits, putting some fire under the feet of provincial governments and premiers, having a royal commission, these are things that Canada has done in the past. A royal commission looking at growth and prosperity issues in the 1980s, for example. So bringing that back, shining a big, bright light on all the areas where Canada can improve is something that might yield a lot of fruit.
Always appreciate the insight, sir. That's University of Calgary economics professor Trevor Tombe. Thank you.
Thank you.